you might be on Britain's New Start, you might find that Brexit is far from done at the end of 2020. Brexit is here to stay. So that is the choice I think Boris Johnson will be contemplating as he sits there now. By Sunday, maybe we'll have a better idea of which way he's plumped.
Thank you, Jill, very much indeed. Tony?
Okay, thanks, and good to see my co-panelists and indeed you, Kevin, again. I'm going to talk about the impact of the Brexit process over the last 4 years on the British political system, which, to summarise what I'm going to say, is rather less than I, for one, would have expected. And let's just begin with the Conservatives, really, who, after all, triggered Brexit. The Conservative leadership at the time, and David Cameron, thought that they could sort out the splits in the party, as Harold Wilson had in 1975. It didn't go so well for him. He resigned the next day after losing the referendum. Mrs. May then struggled with it for 3 years, often in a very dismally awkward way politically. And then she went, Boris Johnson then took over and won an 80-seat majority. So in the best traditions of the Conservative Party's capacity to win throughout, they remain the dominant party of British government, as they have for so very long. So it's not been so bad for the Conservatives so far. Could change, of course. So resilient Conservative Party, which has come through still in control, amazingly. Labour, on the other hand, and Jill's just referred to this, is even now struggling with a sort of existential problem of how to handle both Brexit and COVID, because they find themselves endlessly having to defend appearing to undermine the national interest. Penny Mordaunt's been accusing them of this today in Parliament. And the truth is, it looks as if Keir Starmer is positioning himself to support any deal that is suddenly done. And the reason for that is he doesn't want to appear, or he doesn't want his party to appear to be undermining Brexit with his famous those red wall constituencies in the Midlands, in the north in particular, but also in the Midlands. He needs to, as it were, allow Brexit to happen and not appear to be a Remainer party, on the grounds that I suppose the Remainers will still see Labour as slightly more pro-Remain, but he doesn't want lots of Leavers to think that he's terribly pro-Remain. So the Labour Party itself has continues to struggle with these two issues, including Brexit. And although it's made some progress in the polls against the Conservatives, miraculously, and of course COVID's had an influence on this as well, on a good day for Labour, they're running the Conservatives, 40-40. It's still level pegging in the polls. So, but these two parties remain as the main parties. They've survived all of this. So in that sense, the politics of Brexit haven't radically altered those parties. One way that they may do, and Jill also referred to this, is in Scotland, where the outcome of the Brexit process could yet be the straw on the poor old camel's back of independence, leading to the possibility of a second, or at some point the near inevitability of a second referendum, which is quite a big gamble for the SNP, by the way, because if they were to fail to win an independence referendum twice, that would really slightly undermine their credibility. But if Brexit did go badly in the way it was presented to and the way it affected Scotland, that might actually begin the process of breaking up the union. So very important, and we'll hear more about that, no doubt, when Katy speaks about Northern Ireland. So, of course, to some extent, in trying to disentangle what Brexit's done to politics, you can't escape the fact that COVID has distracted us all from Brexit. For much of this year, it's been COVID in the media, and Brexit's only made a kind of struggling comeback in the last 10 days or so. And I think looking forward, and to the impact of all of this on politics, and I'm sure Vicky's going to refer to this, one of the curiosities of Brexit is that the final end of transition, the end of everything from January the 1st, will coincide with rapid growth in the UK economy, assuming that the vaccine works and the economy starts to move back to something like normal next year, whatever normal is, then next year will be a year of sharp economic growth. And that will be the first visible sign, apparently, of what Brexit did. So I'm not saying it's because of Brexit, but it will complicate understanding what the impact of either a thin deal or no deal is on the British political system. So lastly, as I come up to my 5 or so minutes, as I said at the beginning, I'm struck by how the impact on mainstream British politics, in my view, and on the political parties has been curiously rather less than I would have expected of 4.5 years of epic struggle affecting all aspects of British political life, which is not to say that there couldn't be long-term impacts. Not least of which, because I'm struck at, even as we speak, about the curious lack of detailed plans, either for no deal if it were to happen, or reshaping the economy, whatever happens. And those things are, I think, very odd absences in the whole of the UK's political system at the moment. But just beyond that, I'd say it's inevitable that an impact as big as Brexit, on top of an impact as on top of an event as big as COVID, is going to change the political landscape. It will change the economic landscape, and I think it will change cultural and societal attitudes in ways that are very hard to predict at the moment. So just one final thought. For the Conservative Party, which I've sort of said as ever done remarkably well through all of this, they're going to have to decide if they're going to be a party of free global trade or a party of protecting jobs in the places that voted for Brexit. And that is a very hard call for a party which contains lots of senior politicians who like to be global free traders, but who are now having a voter base which actually wants the world to be a bit more like it used to be in the past, with jobs protected and so on. So even though I'd say the impacts have been relatively limited so far, I can see that they could become much greater, as Jill has said. We've only just begun, to quote the song. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Tony, very much. And that leads us very nicely to Vicky and the economic dimension.
Thank you very much. What I'll do is I'm going to share my screen, because we agreed in advance that somebody has to show some slides just to change the pattern a bit. And the really good thing, as we were discussing with Kevin earlier, is actually bad for the economy, but really good thing for this presentation is that we don't have a deal yet, which means that I can show some of my no deal slides, which otherwise I would have just thrown out of the window. So here we go. I'll try and share it. Okay, I hope that's come through. I don't know whether you can see it yet.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go into my full screen. It's a bit slow usually. There we go. Okay, so I'll have to rattle through them. There are quite a lot of them, but bear with me. So the first thing to bear in mind is that we have actually done rather worse than most other countries that we're comparing ourselves with. And also the forecasts for next year are pretty bad for the UK. Now, you may wonder why we've done so badly. Well, the government has said that perhaps COVID is a problem in the sense that we are more of a service economy than some other countries, and that's really the reason for it, because all the face-to-face contacts had to be stopped, and therefore we suffered more. But in reality, of course, there are two things. We went into lockdown later. Maybe some of the policies were inappropriate in terms of how to deal with the health issue, but also there is a suggestion, and there was a very interesting article in the Times just a few days ago that Tony pointed out, suggesting that in fact perhaps we should be wondering whether it is partly Brexit related. And it's really interesting because when you look at what's been going on in relation particularly to business investment, what you found is that uncertainty has increased very significantly in the last few years, certainly since the actual vote. That's when we started looking at the Brexit uncertainty index, and I'm referring to this, which is Nick Bloom and Bank of England that have produced this in the latest publication, and that shows that obviously there was some Brexit uncertainty, which then this index started going up, and when we reached the various deadlines, and you remember all these deadlines that were missed were all deadlines when this panel more or less was doing an LSE event. it has been going up and down depending on whether we thought we'd leave or not leave, whether the deal, whether the Parliament will vote everything down or not. Anyway, and here we are now, of course, leaving, and the Brexit Uncertainty Index has gone up. So that affects investment very significantly. And if you look back, you will probably notice that we have had a disproportionate fall in investment in the UK in relation to other countries because of Brexit. And that, of course, affects productivity, growth, and it will affect our prospects in the future as well. And when you look at what businesses have been doing, this is another interesting graph, which gives here the number of transactions that have taken place. It's both M&A transactions and greenfield investments. And what it shows in the more solid line is UK firms, the number of transactions they've been involved in with the rest of Europe. And what you see is that for quite some time, they were more or less the same as those transactions from countries outside the EU, other OECD countries that were investing in Europe. But since the referendum, whereas Europe didn't look particularly exciting as a place to invest in, we have carried on, in fact, investing in elsewhere. And of course, we have seen that accelerating in the financial sector recently, with lots of funds moving across and loads of companies setting up in other parts of the EU in order to avoid some of the negative impacts of Brexit. So that is the past. What about the future? Well, COVID has been a main short-term problem, without any doubt, and a lot of what happens in the future will depend on whether the vaccine works. And as Tony was suggesting, perhaps some of the impacts of Brexit aren't going to be felt in relation to figures for GDP for next year that are very discernible. Nevertheless, even in the Bank of England forecasts, the latest ones, they have also made an assumption that Brexit might take around 1% of GDP, possibly more, next year. And that is, of course, on the assumption of a proper deal and a proper free trade agreement. We'll avoid a recession. We will be double recession. We'll come out of this, but Brexit will nevertheless keep things slightly below where they would otherwise have been. As I said, we may not feel it particularly, but it's still going to be there. And we know from all these firms that are complaining right now about the impact that even an FTA will have in terms of the ease of doing business with Europe. Interestingly, when you look longer term, this is where the hit comes. There is now general agreement that either an FTA or a no-deal Brexit, of course it will be worse, are going to have much longer impacts on the UK economy than COVID itself. Of course, COVID may still be around for a while, but in the long term, it's going to be considerably less significant, whereas, in fact, all the government work that had been done did suggest that a no-deal Brexit would reduce UK GDP by almost 8% after 15 years, and we'll have a 5% decline with an FTA. Much depends, of course, on what type of FTA. And right now, if there is a deal, it's quite likely to be a skinny deal. In other words, a very hard Brexit type deal, which may, in fact, lead to more of a decline than would otherwise be the case. What will that mean for individual sectors? I think that's the interesting thing about bringing COVID and also Brexit together. These are forecasts by the OECD of what a no-deal Brexit would do. It would affect particularly sectors that are impacted by tariffs, of course, in terms of export, motor vehicles and transport more generally. But you can see that actually a no-deal does affect, as you go down the list, it gets down to finance and insurance also being affected. And that is quite significant because, of course, there are huge non-tariff barriers that exist in the service sector. And of course, the financial sector is one where by now we should have had some agreement. In fact, by June that passed, we should have had an agreement on what the equivalence regimes were likely to be between the two of us, the UK and the EU, or rather there should have been an agreement and some announcement by each of those two parties in terms of how they were going to approach equivalence in the future. And that statement has not come, and it leaves quite a lot of financial institutions in a bit of a limbo, because obviously they're not going to have passporting arrangements anymore, no mutual recognition for any third country. But of course, we haven't been declared a third country yet, and that makes life difficult. And of course, if you look at the longer term issues, This is the OBR scenarios. The unemployment figures get considerably worse. And the one to look at here is the WTO scenario under a number of different assumptions, because of course you have the virus, if it's dealt with easily or not dealt easily, but you see what types of unemployment rates we might have if you superimpose the WTO scenario, in other words, no deal for the UK. So it means a very substantial deterioration in the employment situation in the UK with a no deal. What you've also got in an OECD study that came out in December, it looks at what happens to the government deficit and to the government debt to GDP ratio. In all those cases, it gets worse. If you have a no deal Brexit, but also if you have an FTA. So you get worse debt to GDP ratio, you collect less tax, but that is of course because your economy is growing less fast in all those scenarios. And of course, I mean, the reason is that we are trading with the EU a lot more than we do with anyone else. And of course, right now, the chances of a US-UK trade deal have declined because of Biden, but the rest of the countries in Europe matter hugely. And the reality is that we have now signed quite a lot of deals with various countries to continue the EU arrangements that existed while we were still in the EU. The latest one is Singapore, signed today, December the 10th. Nevertheless, all those countries, if you look at the data and the exports that we had, the trade we had with them so far, they account for something like 11% of our trade. Whereas if you look at the EU, it accounts for 45% of our exports of goods and services. What does it mean for the future? And this is where COVID and, of course, Brexit come together. What we've seen so far is that despite the fact that parts of our economy, such as the service sector, suffered quite significantly and lots of people either lost their jobs or were furloughed, manufacturing has done reasonably well. And if you look at the latest data, yes, we got some bad figures for October in the sense that GDP grew but didn't grow very fast, mainly because of service decline. Manufacturing has maintained growth for a number of months now. What is likely to happen, if you look at the slides that I showed you earlier, manufacturing will be particularly badly affected by no deal. Also, it will be affected by an FTA because of the extra restrictions in terms of checks and controls and safety requirements and rules of origin, etc. So it's going to be a double whammy, if you like. So it's going to hit the economy negatively in more ways than one, and that is really the issue and of concern about where we might be going. So finally, just to remind ourselves how important services are. The EU is the one area where we do actually sell loads of our services more generally, but financial services in particular. But if you look across the service sector, there are loads and loads of areas where most areas, in fact, where trade, because of non-tariff barriers, is going to become much harder. And as you know, the EU today has announced some unilateral decisions to allow transport, at least, to carry on, whether it's air or by boat or by car somehow, trains, to continue for a while unhampered by a no-deal scenario, which may well be what we end up with. So I will close here with just the reminder that no deal is pretty bad news for the UK, but any Brexit seems to be pretty bad news anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky, very much indeed. And let's now move to Katy, and I imagine issues of Ireland and Northern Ireland and Brexit. Katy.
Right. Hello, Kevin, and hello, everybody from greetings from Belfast. I'm really delighted to be on this panel today for two main reasons. Firstly, it's the LSE, of course, and I want to pay particular tribute to the LSE Brexit blog, which is managed so efficiently and which was kind enough to publish a piece of mine yesterday. It's a great contribution to all our Brexit debates. And also, I'm grateful because you're talking about Northern Ireland. And I will give a wee bit of detail in relation to the protocol, but I do think that even the very situation in which Northern Ireland has been put by Brexit just reveals quite how much that Brexit will transform the United Kingdom as a state. So I'm going to look at two dimensions. First is the question of where we are now. And I'm pleased to say we're a little bit clearer as to where we are and where we're going in Northern Ireland, at least, compared to the way we were at the beginning of the week. And then I'll just note some unresolved questions that still need to be addressed looking ahead. So yes, progress made this week. In some ways, I suspect there was an intention to sort of clear the decks of Northern Ireland for a while to concentrate on the UK-EU deal. And from our point of view over here, that's been very welcome. Essentially, this agreement in principle that we've seen from Gove and Sefcovic was really just to implement the agreement that had been already made. And it's just, we haven't yet seen the detail. Apparently it's going to be published this evening in a command paper, but there are some really important things that we can be pleased about. So for example, on the movement of goods between GB and NI, apparently there's going to be a trusted trader scheme, so a new initiative that'll help keep the movement of goods flowing, even in the event of a no deal between GB and NI. We have some good news that we'll still continue to get our shelves full of chilled meats and food products, at least for 3 months anyway, as they waive the export health certificate requirements for certain things. We're also going to have supply of medicine for human and veterinary use for the next 12 months anyway. That's also good news. NI to GB, they're going to not have to have the exit summary declarations, which was a tokenistic thing apart from anything else. That's good news. Decisions apparently around agriculture and fish subsidies, also good. And the EU will have a monitoring presence. So that will also reassure the EU side that this isn't a huge leap in the dark as far as they're concerned. So less ambiguity than there was, confirmation from both sides that there's an intention to implement the protocol as fully as they can on the 1st of January. That's all good news. A deal would make a huge difference still for various reasons, which I'm happy to talk about. So what are the unresolved questions? Well, just in relation to those details, so businesses have been issuing many questions on the actual practicalities of Brexit and operating the protocol for some time. We're still, for example, waiting to know about what will happen for parcels coming from GB to NI. Will we get our Amazon deliveries, for example? Those things are still to be resolved. But I think the biggest question is how will we operate the system that is the protocol without the means of operating it? So without going into too much detail, it's very clear that the mechanisms for implementing the protocol that are being rolled out, such as goods vehicle movement system, customs declaration service, the trader support service, all of these things have not been tried and tested. This is a big question mark over what happens next. And then in relation to the other unresolved or key issues that need to be addressed, I just want to mention the 3 strands of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, because that is underpinning, of course, the rationale for the protocol in the first place. So first and foremost, Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive. The blame game is just, it's very live anyway in Northern Ireland. It's absolutely ripe for exploitation, particularly in the event of a no deal and all that the insecurity that would arise from that. Brexit is toxic. I know it's toxic in GB as well, but it's really toxic here. And you can just see very easily how unionists would blame Remainers for the existence of the protocol and bad things that inconveniences around that, and how Remainers would blame unionists, leavers for Brexit itself. So it's a really difficult matter. Huge pressures on the executive, and the question would be, how would you maintain power sharing, especially in a situation of increasing polarization? Another question in relation to that is, how will we scrutinize and shape the decisions that will be made that will affect Northern Ireland most directly? This is a huge issue that hasn't been addressed yet, but it's going to become increasingly significant as the protocol continues in force, as Northern Ireland is dynamically aligned to the EU. and as GB diverges. Another area is, of course, North-South cooperation. Article 11 of the protocol deals with that in fairly broad and vague ways, but essentially the question would be, okay, so you've wanting to maintain the conditions for North-South cooperation across broadcasting, inland fisheries, telecommunications, etc., etc. What does that look like in practice? How will you do that, and how will you assess whether you're managing to do that? Where are you getting the information from in order to assess whether you're doing that? This is a joint committee responsibility now. It's not just British Irish, it's not North-South, it's UK-EU responsibility. These are hugely important. And then finally, the third strand, of course, is the East-West relationship. We have the centenary year of Northern Ireland, the centenary of partition next year, in 2021. And interestingly enough, the Irish government has decided to implement a strategic review of the British-Irish relationship in this centenary year. Probably no time like the present. So the question would be, from the UK side, what are you going to do to protect that British-Irish relationship? How will you demonstrate a commitment to that British-Irish relationship upon which the peace process depends? Finally, overarching all of this, the fundamental question is, how will the United Kingdom work with the European Union in the interests of Northern Ireland to achieve the objectives of the protocol as an ongoing joint concern, as a joint responsibility now? That relationship of trust that is necessary for that will be all the more difficult in the event of a no deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, very much indeed. Well, we've covered quite a range. I do want to go to the questions which are already coming in from the audience, but I wonder if I could just kick off with a few questions of my own. And perhaps if I direct my first question to Jill and Tony together, please. And that is that in these days leading up to Sunday, you both described the choices of deal and no deal very well indeed. But let me put to you a narrative about Brexit, that Brexit was born out of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, and it may finish with the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And my point is whether you think for the Prime Minister, the costs of no deal are actually less for him in terms of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, and that they may weigh, those considerations may weigh more heavily on Boris as he calculates these choices in the next few days than the wider aspects that we've covered. Can I invite Jill and then Tony to respond?
Okay, I have to say, I didn't totally agree with Tony about his analysis of politics. I'm a bit nervous about not agreeing with Professor Travers on this, because, you know, what do I know? But I think one of the things that's quite interesting is that I think Brexit has changed the Conservative Party. Maybe it's just accelerated a trend, but if you look at the sort of people, I think it's actually a trend over time. But the people who are now in the Conservative Party, and the effect of last year's expulsions of what you might call the sort of moderate Remainers, ex-Remainers from the Conservative Party, has meant that Boris Johnson does indeed have a quite different set of people behind him. And I do think that the people at the moment who make the most noise are those who are primed to yell sellout. What we can't tell, I WhatsApped a friend of mine who's a conservative sort of One Nation person and said, are you guys not putting any pressure on Boris that he has to do a deal? And his line was, yes, but we're not making a noise about it because we don't want to be accused of undermining the UK's negotiating position. So I think there may actually be two factions, not in the cabinet's sort of pre-selected for loyalty and compliance. But I do think that if he fails to do a deal, we will hear from some people on the Conservative benches who have been quite quiet now. So I think this compounds the problem for the Prime Minister, that the party will be quite split on that. But the party in the country is probably more pro no deal, if anything. And that sort of difference, my colleagues Tim Bale and Alan Wager and Will Jones done some work on the values of members, MPs and voters. And members are, it's quite polarized. We have quite extreme members in both political parties compared necessarily to their voters. So I think there's quite a lot of principled people there, but I'd be interested in what Tony thinks.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I wonder, next week in Parliament, would Boris Johnson get an easier time with his backbenchers if he comes back with no deal rather than the deal?
Well, at the risk of giving an unhelpful answer, it slightly depends what the deal amounted to. I mean, because it is possible that what we're living through now in the sort of slightly pantomime season, will they, won't they, end of the negotiations period, if it is the end, is, all a bit of a smokescreen for a gentle climb down. I mean, you can't deny that as a possibility. So it would be possible to argue we've done this great deal because the EU backed down at the last moment because we left it all right to that point. But just going back to Jill's reasonable questioning of my excellent thesis. I mean, I was simply trying to highlight the fact that, in fact, that I think we're actually on the same page, really, because the Conservative Party has changed, there's no doubt, but it changes all the time, and it changes to win and stay in power, is my point. And it's managing, the question is it changing in a way that leads to some terrible fallout of the kind that, Kevin, your question is sort of referring to, or is this yet another iteration in this incredibly adaptable Stanley Baldwin plus party that always manages to reconfigure itself to reflect the future in a way that, say, the Liberals didn't in the early part of the 20th century. And I think that the jury's out on that. I mean, Conservative MPs are more rebellious than, as Phil Cowley's books pointed out, backbenchers have become more and more and more rebellious in recent years, way before Brexit, way before COVID. And, there's an intriguing sub-issue here, which is, I'm sure Jill will have an explanation for this, why so many of the ERG types, the most pro-hard Brexit, are also the most anti-lockdown. That's a fascinating overlap. So, they're going to rebel on that issue next. In fact, they've already done it. So he clearly doesn't need factions within his party. But on the other hand, as he's discovered with COVID, the Labour Party will support him. Even if the Conservative Party splits on a deal, Labour will almost certainly support them. Their own numbers are big enough to get it through anyway, unless Labour opposed it. So, I think the more intriguing question is in how does this all play out in the long term when the full impacts of no deal, and some of Vicky's slides are very interesting on this. If the car industry is going to do as badly as Vicky's slides suggest, which, I mean, those are the figures, then places like Sunderland, the question is, will the government have to step in to protect the car industry? Yeah. Is that why they want all this freedom under the, not so level playing field rules? Yes. And so on?
Vicky is with us. Could I switch to the economic dimension? Is Vicky still with us? Perhaps we'll come back to the economic dimension, but Katy, can I come to you? You finished on the theme about the British-Irish relationship, and I wonder if we could just ask you to go a little bit further in terms of if the outcome is no deal or if the outcome is a deal. What do you think is more likely to strengthen or weaken that relationship? And perhaps I'm thinking in particular about the Conservative Party. During this Brexit drama, of course, the relationship between the Conservative Party and the Ulster Unionists became critical at various stages. And I wonder if the outcome is no deal or a deal, how that impacts on that kind of relationship.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating question. And this is always a challenge for unionists in Northern Ireland, like quite how much can they trust the British government, where do they throw their lot in? And they certainly wouldn't do it with the Irish government. So sort of pinning an awful lot of hope on what the British government might do. And the reaction, this week to the confirmation about the implementation of the protocol from unionism has been one of concern and sort of repeated sense of betrayal. So we have those tensions in that relationship. This is despite the fact that the Tory government has been very explicit in its pro-union sentiments, and it's been striking actually quite how strong it's been on that point, almost to almost sort of neglecting the significance of nationalist identity and Irish identity and Irish citizenship in Northern Ireland. That has been very much left up to the Irish government to emphasise, which hasn't necessarily been a very longer term. I don't think that's a really sustainable situation. So the more you have a situation in which the two governments appear to represent two different communities in Northern Ireland, it's not good. It really should be in the joint interest of Northern Ireland. I mean, in terms of on the high level and on the sort of immediate economic shock, no deal would be obviously a damaging thing to the British-Irish relationship. And the high level, I mean, because Ireland has been absolutely unambiguous about its EU identity, and it's really laying it on thick, for good reason, and so its interests lie with the EU, and that's where it's going to be. And if there's a no deal, obviously that divergence between the EU and the UK will be reflected in the British-Irish relationship. But longer term, more direct challenges will be the fact that we just don't have those forums anymore for a wider range of government ministers and officials to mingle and to get that relationship. And any official you speak to, or indeed politician, about the peace process in Northern Ireland, which took such a long time to develop, was very carefully developed. A lot of that was just on familiarity. And the EU is a really important context for that. And I think longer term, we will really miss that sort of day-to-day interaction at a very sort of practical level.
Thanks, Katy. Vicky, I wonder if we could come to the economic dimension. Let me put to you a narrative. Brexit was never about economics. People voted for other reasons, and you've given a very expert and very clear set of forecasts about the implications of deal or no deal. But the point was made earlier that in the next year, in the medium term, perhaps beyond, the picture will become very unclear. We've got COVID, other extraneous factors entering into it, etc. So from the point of view of the Brexit voter, it was never about economics. And in the next year or so, trying to assess the economic impacts will be very, very difficult anyway. So it would not be a game changer.
I think that's true if you're looking at the economic data, but it's not going to be true if you're looking at some of the disruption that is likely to take place. The fact that it's going to cost businesses a lot more to be doing, to be selling to Europe than was the case before. It might also cost them a lot more bringing things in. Although, of course, here, as you know, we're not going to have any proper checks for 6 months. We're only really going to be requiring a certificate if there are substances that we are controlling or trying to control, including alcohol, that come in from Europe. So you have a little bit of a leeway. Yes, of course, we had this morning supermarkets saying that costs are going to go up significantly if there is no deal because of tariffs. And they've also had disruptions in the ports because of some stockpiling that was taking place to avoid some of those tariffs, which may come through in the future. So that may indeed be the case. But certainly in terms of selling or any access to Europe, the number of certificates you require are quite significant. For the road hauliers as well are going to have to be proving all sorts of things in terms of what they're carrying. They will need to have a passport to Kent as well, and exiting it as well. So there are definitely going to be a lot more barriers to trade. Now, will people feel that immediately, perhaps they'll lose their jobs as a result. Maybe firms aren't going to be bothering in the short term, hiring more people in those various areas. Maybe they will start changing the supply chains. So maybe they will have supply chains, particularly manufacturing, which are elsewhere. Maybe they will move their productions. It will take time. Some has happened already, and you're quite right that it's not going to be felt immediately. And that's why the stress in my slides is the medium to long term is where the impact will be felt. The no deal will be felt a lot earlier, the FTA a little bit later. But it's still going to be there, and it's going to be reflected in negative investment growth, in the sense that at least less than would otherwise have been the case. Yes, there'll be some onshoring. There will be some areas where that can happen. Textiles is one that is very often mentioned, is the one where this will happen. But I think overall, it means a dislocation. It means things moving out. And I mentioned financial services. They're not loved, and the voter doesn't really care, but they do employ loads of people, directly or indirectly, about 2 million. That is quite considerable. If any of this changes, people will feel it. But you're quite right. The vote, to a considerable extent, wasn't economics, but nevertheless, people were made to feel that nothing much would change, that they weren't really going to suffer economically. And COVID has confused the issue, of course, very significantly. It will, I think, take a few years before one realizes maybe what one has given up.
Thanks very much indeed. Let me now go to the many questions which are coming in. And I'm going to try to combine two questions. There's a very specific question for Katy, which is from Anne Dayton in Oxford, I think. So to Katy, if you look ahead, say 5 years or so, would you assert that for Belfast, the gravitational pull will increasingly be to Dublin rather than to London? If so, is this driven by politics as much as economics? And then the question, I think for Tony and Jill, if I may, is from Kevin Kerrigan, which says that, I'm sorry, that's the wrong question, which is from John Newham. Will Brexit be a catalyst for the breakup of the UK? So let's start with Katy on Northern Ireland, and then Tony and Jill on breakup of the UK. Katy.
That's a really good question. I think there's an assumption, particularly on the EU side, that sort of the gravitational pull towards the EU single market will naturally change the shape of Northern Ireland's economy, and that advantage that Northern Ireland has will be exploited down over time. So specifically on that question, I would have some doubts about that, even aside from the politics, partly because it takes a lot of time. Also partly the fact that we have this consent vote in 4 years' time, and then potentially every 4 years, or at least every 8 years, around the arrangements for the protocol. So it's not as if, longer term that we can be absolutely confident that this will be Northern Ireland's situation. That element of doubt is definitely present, certainly for the first 5 years, I would imagine. But who knows? And then more broadly on the political sense, the only way you can see Northern Ireland is really, it's integrated to Britain, it's integrated into Ireland. This is why we are where we are. And this is what the Good Friday Agreement tried to balance and manage. And that was possible in the context of the EU. There is a risk with the protocol and with the situation that we're entering now, that it will just, rather than going one particular direction, it'll just sort of spin. And then you have the centrifugal forces within Northern Ireland that will just sort of lead to increasing pressure, i.e. wouldn't go anywhere in particular, which is very uncomfortable for many people. So I don't know, I think this is why I go back to that British-Irish relationship and the need for very clear decision, followed up by action on the part of the British government about that British-Irish relationship. This is important, and it needs to be important that North-South cooperation, economic practically, politically, civically is not politicised, just as Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market is facilitated in meaningful, serious ways, and why the UK government needs to recognise the importance of devolution, not just in Northern Ireland, indeed across the UK, but it simply is a way of keeping the UK together.
Thank you. That leads us nicely to Jill and Tony on the possible breakup of the UK. I know it's a huge question. The audience knows it's a huge question, but could I invite you to give a fairly brief answer, please? Jill, do you want to start?
Okay, brief answer. The sort of Brexit we're going to have makes the economic case for independence much harder, the practical case much harder, because you get back to the same issues of the border that has been so troubling for GB and Northern Ireland, where you don't have the advantage of a sea between Scotland and England, but it makes the identity case much stronger. And that's going to be the battle lines.
Thank you. Tony?
Yes, I certainly agree that the dismal struggle over the last 4 years that's still ongoing would certainly make some, I would imagine, some Scottish voters wonder just how difficult that would be. And of course, Scotland would then be, imagine chopping the debt up after recent events. I mean, the scale of the debt that Scotland would begin with, the share of the UK's debt. So I think there are some very serious practical issues, and that's even before you get to the EU's attitude to Scotland applying to join the European Union if it left the United Kingdom, all very uncertain. So, as I said, I think it's a bit more difficult for the SNP than it looks, because although recent polling has shown Leave winning against Remain within the UK quite by some margin, I still think for the SNP, if they were to hold a second referendum and not win it, that could be quite damaging in the long term for the entire SNP project. So they've got to be really certain that when they hold this referendum, they win it. So I think it's not quite as obvious this will go one way, i.e. towards independence or the breakup of the union, as it's sometimes portrayed.
Okay, thank you. Vicky, if I may, there are two economic questions, and perhaps you could address the two together. So there's a question from Richard Carpenter, which says, how competitive would the UK be? We don't seem to manufacture or provide anything anymore. And the other question from Yancey Westerfield is to say that there's been a lot of rubbishing in recent times of the gravity model of trade. Do you think that the idea of this model is still relevant? And what consequences is it going to have for the UK in the medium term, given that even with a deal, there will be trade disruption and there is a clear desire to diverge from the EU in as many ways as possible? So if you could perhaps combine the two questions. Firstly, how competitive is the UK going to be anyway? And secondly, are we still in our forecasts following a gravitational model? Is that still worthwhile?
Yeah, on the first one, we still produce quite a lot of things. So we had quite a strong car manufacturing sector, for example. There's quite a lot of innovation that is still there. Yes, the car manufacturers have now been saying, they haven't been producing as much because of COVID, but also diesel and other scandals and the trade disputes that the US in particular had with China, and China not buying our cars, that sort of stuff. But that should be sorting itself out. But they're very worried about no deal in particular and FTA more generally. So who knows what will happen there. We have a strong service sector, quite strong financial sector, of course. So we have quite a lot that we do produce, so we mustn't get too depressed about this. Nevertheless, it's absolutely true that we haven't been investing enough and that we have been losing in relation to other countries. So productivity has suffered, our competitiveness has suffered. And what I fear is that whether we have no deal or an FTA, if you're actually looking at where our trade will be going in the future, and that's very much linked with this, the second question, it still would have to depend on what happens with our closest neighbors. The gravity model works, in my view. It has already proved that this is how things move in any case. we are very dependent on countries that are close to us. We're very dependent on the EU, and we sell 45% of our goods and services to them. No other place is admittedly, there are individual differences in terms of the countries, but no other place can if you like, receive as many of the goods that we produce. And all those trade deals that we are arranging now have a minimal impact in terms of making up for any loss in our trade. And that is particularly true in the area of services, where we do have a positive balance of payments on services overall, and we earn quite a lot from service exports to the EU. I mean, remember, we are the major area for firms, non-financial corporations in Europe to raise money, whether it's in the debt market or in the equity market, for example. We are the main derivative traders. We do most of the foreign exchange trade, dealing here and so on. So that is of great concern. Plus, of course, quite a lot of our business services that have developed around the financial sector, and they will also suffer because they've done incredibly well selling their services in Europe, even though there are still issues with some of the qualifications and acceptances across, which will get worse, of course, with this. Now, what do we do in the future to remain competitive? Well, it's very interesting because listening, as one does to every bit of news about Brexit or anything now, not just because one does it all from home, but also because this is the thing of the day, of the week, of the year, of the last 4 years on Brexit. The CBI chief economist today was saying, what we need is more investment and then we'll sort out problems. Well, how are you going to get that unless you have a clear path ahead and you have no impediments to growth? You can spend loads of money as government if you can continue to borrow, but you still need the private sector to deliver the innovation that you need. So I'm afraid looking at prospects for trade, and looking for where the UK will be with any deal that may come, we're going to be at a competitive disadvantage for some time to come in relation to other countries, in relation to Europe and others. I mean, Europe is investing heavily in green. We're not doing it anything like as much as we should do, despite what the Prime Minister may be trying to convince us he's doing. So I think we're going to have a weak pound, and the only way that we're going to survive in the short to medium term will be with the pound, despite the fact that it might strengthen if we have a deal, will then need to be weak in order to continue to provide us with some of the revenues that we want from our exports. But it's not a long-term solution, so I do worry.
Okay. Whilst we're with the economic theme, I wonder if I can just ask a further question to Vicky, but just briefly, please. This is from Kevin Kerrigan, formerly of the Foreign Office and formerly of UCREP in Brussels. And he refers to the EU's contingency plan that was released today. And he says, does that plan, if implemented, change any of your economic projections of a no deal at all? Just briefly.
Well, the contingency plan is short term, as far as I understand it. And so we're carrying on with a number of things as we were before, which is rather nice. So for me, it would be rather nice if we had, in effect, at some point agreed this month, a continuation of the transition period, so that we can sort some of these things out in terms of how they would work in practice. So let's hope that this leads to that. Thank
you. Could I add a question here for Jill, please? We've been talking about no deal as a scenario, but can I pick up on your experience with Institute for Government and in Whitehall? And could you give us a comment on, at this stage, how prepared you think Whitehall is for a no deal?
Well, I think one of the things to remember is that deal and no deal aren't very different from the point of view of disruption and things like that. The big difference is tariffs, but in terms of the systems you need in place, managing the ports, managing the changes for individuals, all of those things are the same for deal and no deal. I did a podcast on this last week, talking about the collision of Brexit and COVID, and maybe we've seen the Cabinet Office's worst case scenario of adding in flooding, maybe adding in another animal health disease, all of which could happen next month. So I'd recommend that. So IFG podcast. Claire Moriarty is the permanent secretary at DexEU and DEFRA. Tom O'Riordan, chief executive of Leeds City Council, quite a flood-prone council. He's also been working in test and trace, and it really is quite stretching. Government, I think, thinks that it is as ready as it possibly can be, but as Katy said, they've got systems there, but they haven't done the end-to-end testing you might have liked to have seen. But the real worry, as it has been throughout the year, is that businesses aren't ready and therefore will not be ready to comply. And actually, even if we got a deal, a lot of businesses won't be ready to take advantage of a deal. The big difference is tariffs. To have tariffs, you need to have your rules of origin documentation ready. If you've only done business with the EU before, you won't have set up those systems necessarily. Michael Gove said people are 80% ready. We know their capacity constraints on things like customs agents and stuff like that. So it's going to be a bumpy time. I think the Cabinet Office thinks you won't get maximum bumpiness in the first week or two because of the stockpiling effects we're noting. It'll start to kick in from sort of mid-January. You'll see probably more problems when people have run down their stocks and things like that. But I think, you know, the government last year was thinking 3 to 6 months of potential difficulty before people start properly adjusting. But we know that the bandwidth in business has also been very constrained, as has cash flow, by the needing to manage COVID at the same time. That's one reason why lots of people thought the government might take the option of seeking the extension, which they had the right to do until the end of June.
Thanks. Tony, if I could come to you. Anthony, an LSE alumnus, asks, how are things shaping up for the UK rejoining, and how are things looking for the Liberal Democrats? And I guess part of the question is to say that if Labour backs a Boris deal, does this create a space for the Liberal Democrats to promote the re-entry option? And how do you think that might play? So really the question is, what do you think the party politics are looking like in terms of an agenda, a campaign for rejoining, and where does it leave the Liberal Democrats?
Well, and I'm sorry I didn't talk about the Liberal Democrats. Partly, I'm afraid the fact I didn't tells you something about the way I'm about to go with this answer, which is, you know, given the trauma from their point of view of the coalition, and then the, well, after the coalition, and then the failure to be able to exploit being the one true party of Remain in the British two-party system, which it still is. I think that their chances, you know, and their opinion poll ratings remain such as to suggest it's going to take them some years to rebuild. Chances of a rejoining movement, I mean, there'll be one, I'm sure. Chances of it getting anywhere, I'd say, as near to naught as you can reasonably be in any society. And the reason for that is, you know, I've always wondered whether President de Gaulle didn't kind of get this right, and that the British joining the EU was always going to be difficult. And I suspect the EU itself will see that. And, you know, I just don't see the consequences of Brexit being as visibly bad or bad enough at any point suddenly to make there be an enormous change of view. Partly because if it does go badly wrong, it'll all be blamed on the European Union by Brexiteers. So I just think the only constructive way forward for British politics, in my own view now, is to think to the medium term and how to construct a relationship with the EU that works in the long term from outside, which is a deliverable idea, and there's nobody thinking about it much yet.
Well, thanks. That perhaps connects with the question from Mike O'Donnell, another LSE alumnus, and it's in the context of figures like Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, saying that the Remainers after the referendum got it wrong and have encouraged a hard Brexit by disputing the referendum, by calling for a second referendum, etc. And Mike O'Donnell's question is, does the panel, so this is for the panel, does the panel think that many will regret not supporting Theresa May's deal? Jill, do you want to start off on that?
Okay, well, this is Anna and Manon and I didn't write Peter Mandelson's article in The Guardian, but we did write something called Who Killed Soft Brexit for Prospect, which has caused a lot of Twitter agonizing about this, about who is responsible for the sort of Brexit we have. I think there are undoubtedly some Labour leavers, some Labour people who thought they ought to back the result of the referendum, who now realise that had they managed to sustain not just the Theresa May withdrawal deal, though it actually had quite a lot of hooks that arguably would have led to a softer form Brexit. Theresa May set out very harsh red lines at Lancaster House, but then proceeded to row back from them to some extent, certainly by Chequers. She was softening a bit on some of them, though not all, who now think they actually would be in a happier place with the sort of protections that Theresa May was prepared to offer up to get her withdrawal agreement through. There is, of course, the interesting question of, if she'd done that, could she have stayed leader of the Conservative Party? Wouldn't we have ended up in the same place anyway? There's also the question of, could you actually, and a lot of people cite Jeremy Corbyn as a big barrier to this. Could you actually have had some way in which Parliament, last year could have kept the government on life support for longer and forced a different sort of Brexit? So I think there's some very interesting questions. I think a really interesting question, and this is sort of, for Tony as a professor of political science, is it is quite interesting that such a narrowly split decision, the sort of 52-48 in our system, has sort of ended up in what you can only say is the most stunning victory for the European Research Group and their supporters. They were, in the 2015 and the 2017 parliaments, quite a minority in the Conservative Party and a distinct minority in Parliament. And yet they have pulled off the most tremendous coup. And you either have to think they are absolutely the most brilliant people with a direct line into the mental state of the British people, or you have to think that some other people, also perhaps help them along to that. But I'd be very interested.
Okay, thanks.
In,
Tony,
thanks.
Thanks for that, Jill.
The initial question was, do we regret Theresa May's deal not passing?
Well, we all love counterfactuals, and it's a good one to mull on. It's not really it was a factual at one point. It's now become a counterfactual. I agree with Jill's analysis. I think it is conceivable that if enough people who didn't want a hard Brexit had coalesced behind Theresa May's softer worldview as it evolved, probably it would have been possible to get that through, and that would have led to a softer Brexit than the one we're going to get. But it is now in buried in history. And on I think the fact that median voters didn't really get a look in on this one, did they? Hardline voters got what they want, and that I think has something to do with the interplay of, certainly in Britain, and it's rather different in Northern Ireland, but the operation of the first past the post voting system and the bloc parties trying to deal with an issue that cuts across those two parties and chops them in half. And the fact that particularly in the 2017 election, Brexit led to resurgence of two-party voting up to 83% suddenly again, having dropped into the 60s at one point, tells us that there's something in the nature of the way first past the post plurality voting works and produces the party system it does has impacted on Brexit and vice versa. And I think that explains how small groups within our political system can occasionally get what they want in a way that wouldn't be possible with a different voting system.
Okay, good. I'm concerned about time, so if colleagues will permit me, can I move on to another question? And I think it's on the economics, Vicky, if I may. This is from Maximilian Conrad, who's joining us from Munich. And he says, is there also something positive you might be able to identify from Brexit, either deal or no deal? You've given us a very pessimistic outlook. Can we identify anything positive from a deal or no deal?
Well, in the interest of time, I will answer it very quickly. No. I find it very difficult to think of anything positive. Maybe others can from a political point of view, but from an economic point of view, with great difficulty.
Can I just add again? I was trying to hint at this at the beginning. I think that is, it's what's happened has happened. And what slightly shocks me is the failure of government to articulate some form of future plan for the economy that moves on and gives the UK a chance to grow in this new and different position. And at the moment, in many ways, as with COVID, the policy seems to be just to sit and see what happens and then react to it. Not very good.
Okay, so but perhaps the answer should be maybe in the longer term there could be something we can do, but for the moment there is no sign of that.
Okay, I don't agree with Vicky, and I think we actually need to get out of that mindset. I think potentially the reforms to the Common Agricultural Policy that Michael Gove put forward, that the government's moving to, frankly, if you can't do better than the CAP, then you've got a real problem. And I think we've spent years carping about it, so let's show that we actually can. I think farmers might regret it because you might decide not to spend so much money on agriculture, but I think that's a good thing. And I do think there is underlyingly a very good thing for our political culture, which is that taking back control means taking back responsibility. It's why it'd be very unfortunate if we just get into a situation where we blame the EU for everything we don't like. And it's one of the reasons actually why I'm sometimes quite pro-Scottish independence. I think actually having a position where we can take our own decisions and hold our politicians accountable could be good after years of erecting a straw man, bogeyman in the shape of the European Union. And I think actually it's quite interesting. Nick Bowles today, former Conservative MP, Remainer, was tweeting that actually, if you look at this year, the EU may be better off without us as well. The UK would have spent the year trying to go slow on things like the COVID recovery fund, getting in the way of quite a lot of things. And I think actually in the longer run, if both can get over this, we could have a healthier and more positive relationship between both.
Okay. Tony, I wonder if I could squeeze in the question from Paul Hallis and invite you to respond to that. And he says, if there is no free trade agreement, how would you assess the political consequences of us seeing long lines of lorries in Kent on the TV news every evening and other media reports on the practical consequences of no deal? I could imagine in a few weeks' time you being invited on the BBC to answer this precise question.
Well, it's interesting that the Operation Brock and the need to have mobile toilets in Kent has kind of captured the public imagination in a way that all the rather more detailed stuff that Jill was referring to about whether the computer systems operate hasn't. And I think that's a problem in terms of getting the message across, oddly, because one thing that the pictures of lines of trucks will have done is convinced some businesses to take a bit more make a bit more effort to get their paperwork in order than would otherwise have been the case. The actual advertising the government's done has been so soft because they didn't want to imply that there was anything wrong with Brexit. It's got to say, oh, things are going to change on January the 1st, as if that's going to get anybody to do very much. So I think that the big question is, do the lines of, the fact is the government can rely on supermarkets to a significant degree. Supermarkets are brilliant at logistics. They will have found ways around lots of these problems, and they still will. So we'll see whether the lines of trucks and the Kent passport produces any kind of super political reaction. But again, I would expect that to be blamed on the EU if it happens and is bad. And at some level, it will be true. That's the Travers, to be absolutely honest. So
let me try to, we can always rely on Waitrose ultimately.
Yeah.
Let me try to squeeze in one last question, which has come in, and to invite each of you to give a very quick answer, please. And that is quite simply, how long do you think it will be before the UK seeks to rejoin the European Union? Vicky?
10 years.
10 years. Jill?
Depends if the EU changes dramatically and has to, but in its current state, not in my lifetime.
Katy?
I probably want to be a bit controversial and say I think there won't be a UK before whatever's left of it tries to join the rejoining.
That's a great point to raise. Sadly, at the very end, Tony, quickly.
I don't think the UK will rejoin the EU, and I don't, as I said earlier, I think that it's working with where we've got to and making something out of that will be the future for politics.
That's great. We are about to run out of time, but can I thank everyone for their participation? And I suppose it's the discussion is just simply underscoring that Brexit isn't just for Christmas. It's going to continue. And of course, the LSE programme on Brexit and beyond will continue in the remainder of this academic year and beyond. And you can find out information by simply Googling LSE programme on Brexit and beyond. Let me thank Jill, Tony, Vicky and Katy for their contributions. And let me thank the audience for their various questions. My apologies, we could not get through all of them. There were many questions coming in. And thank you to the audience. We've had a very large audience for this final 2020 discussion on Brexit. But of course, it's a series. Thank you very much indeed.